I just loaded up the Discord and saw the image that it was being displayed here.
Yeah.
So
Right, we did an
something tells
iceberg
me that,
meme, and now we're doing the Tangled meme.
yeah, this is how timely
It's
we
only
are,
up from here.
guys. Well, I believe about a month ago, I had posted on our community post, that this question was going around on social media, as it often does with a bunch of other
Mm,
topics, right? Like, what opinion about Christmas has you like this? What opinion about music has you like this? And basically, everybody gets to share their really bad takes about things. And I shared what opinion about education would have you like this, and people shared some of their ideas on the YouTube comments there. And I thought this would be fun for us to try to tackle. What's your number ones?
my number one is that when we design projects or even lessons with students, especially interdisciplinary lessons, but it doesn't have to be, we should actually not start with the standards. That's my number one. The typical rationale is that you start by looking at your standards in your class and then making a project or a series of lessons, like a unit plan, as a result of those standards. I actually think the best projects come out of doing it the other way around. You find something that kids are interested in, or that you're just like super interested in. Hopefully, that's both. You design that thing, and then you pair the standards to it later. You do it the other way around. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, and I think it's interesting. It's like that. It's one of those things where it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission,
Hmm.
especially in the humanities, right? Because there's pretty much nothing that you can't do in the humanities, if I got all the double negatives correct in that sentence, that doesn't somehow, right, align to some standard down the line. So, I mean, on this one, I'm going to be standing right in there in the line of fire with you if people think that that's a hot take about education, because yeah, I think an overemphasis on the standards kind of dilutes the whole point of doing interdisciplinary, project based, whatever learning.
I mean, the frustrating part of this is that oftentimes when you're designing a really cool project, the first thing that people will come back to is they'll say, that all sounds great, but none of my standards hit that. Like none of my standards, or even worse, they will say, well, I don't know how any of my standards could be incorporated into something that kids actually do. Like that is inherently problematic because if there's no purpose to the things that you're doing in the class that could be applicable in a real world environment, then why are we even teaching them? And I guess this might also be a hot take. It's not one of my two, but like, I actually do think that you could take any school standard and make it applicable to the real world because there has to be some reason why those things are included there. Even theoretical math has a real life purpose to it.
Since you're adding a hot take 1.5, I'll
Okay.
counter with that hot take 1.5 and say,
Oh.
like, I'm fine with having some standards and some of the things in school that don't necessarily have the real world application, because sometimes I think it's cool and fun just to explore some of those ideas, for their own sake, or if they just have their own internal logic to them that might not ever I guess what I'm
Mm.
saying is I don't think we should measure the validity or not of the things that we do in school by whether they have a concrete outside purpose, because it could be the case that perhaps that purpose has not been yet generated. Like, school and education and academia could be the place where that purpose is discovered and the application sort of comes later.
To be fair, when I say applicability, I don't mean it literally has to like make something or build something. I think you could express ideas through art or that you could present on those ideas and they could still be hyper abstract. So when I say applicability, I don't mean like quite literally it has to impact the real world as much
Okay.
as you should be able to do something with it. Like there has to be some reason why you're learning about it, even if it's entirely in the abstract. Which actually leads me. Can I do a hot take on a hot take? This one
This is
actually
what
this one actually might like piss people off because it's exactly in the same line that you're talking about here, which is I don't think that we should be discouraging kids to go to college. I actually think the vast majority of kids should go to college. So what you're saying about like learning about things you might not actually use, I think is actually a super important part of a liberal arts education. And
ah,
I think the reason why a lot of kids and adults um, don't like college, or even maybe don't even like high school, is that they feel like they're learning about a lot of things they might not ever use on the job. And I think that's more of a pedagogical problem than it is a content problem. So the reason why that stuff feels so boring is that it's typically taught through lectures over things that you don't care about. Instead of getting rid of those classes entirely, I think we should change up the pedagogical structure so that it's at least interesting. Because if you don't do that, you end up with a lot of folks who don't have the necessary like critical thinking or nuanced opinions that you learn by going through those GED classes and high school classes. There's been a movement, in the last, especially I would say like 10, 20 years, to shift to more career-based or trade school type learning. And I mean, I taught a career tech class, so I was teaching kids in this way. I would prefer that kids in those situations would actually go the college route and learn their trade school there, as opposed to just going straight into the workforce. I'm not saying that everyone has to, but I think that as a society, we shouldn't be de-emphasizing the idea of going to college.
It's interesting because there's so many systemic factors at play there, right? Yeah, there
Yeah, I get the
there's the
financial
tired
component. Yeah.
yes. Well, I was gonna say there's the tired conversations about, like, preparedness and college readiness,
Mm,
which again falls along class lines and of socioeconomics and everything else as well. So that's like a real thing, but then also the economic factor, I think, you know, the biggest reason why kids either don't go to college or they drop out before they acquire a degree, like, half, I think, of those reasons are financial in nature, or
right.
at the very least related to family instability. I had to drop out to go take care of a sick, family member or something else like that. I think that often gets reported a lot.
Like, I don't want to make the implication that I'm saying in this is like kind of like a perfect world type scenario. Like, I support free college for everyone. Like, I think in a perfect world, you would pay people a stipend, like a living stipend, to go to school, to encourage people to stay and go to college so that your college is paid for. There's value in just being able to spend time thinking about things that's not economic. It's just it's good for a society to be educated. Perhaps that's like a conservative take.
So Chris's number one um, opinion that would have people upset at him is that we shouldn't start with the standards when we're talking about projects. That we should be able to provide some kind of applicability outside of the walls of
Right.
school.
I have an example too.
And
Yeah.
so I'm just so I'm clear that you have a
Yeah.
three-parter for your first one here,
Yeah.
and that college more kids should go to college than not, and of course we should work to make those systems more sustainable and affordable. That is
Right.
your tripartite number
Right.
one
It's building off of
cancelable.
your 1.5. So this is all in like the same somehow in the same thought process. Can I go really quick back to that idea of starting with projects as opposed to starting with standards? Because I actually have one to share. I looked back. This is from, I want to say, 2015. This is my example, but I'll show you a student example here in a second. I remember this meeting like it was yesterday. So I remember we were sitting down as a team. This was in ninth and 10th grade. And we were deciding what's like a cool project we could do with the kids. I remember I randomly thought to myself, like, man, Comic Con's coming up. That would be cool.
Yeah,
And we decided that we would look into whether or not it would be possible to get all the kids that are interested to take a field trip to the local Comic Cons. This is not like big Comic Con. This is like a local offshoot one. And it turns out that it was actually very cheap. They offer the Comic Con basically gave us free tickets. We just had to get buses to get there. It was like $5 a kid or something, because it was such a unique proposal. They had never had a group of kids come. Um, so we decided, like, oh, we're gonna take the kids to Comic Con. Let's just make the project around that. So we planned backwards. We knew we wanted kids to do something involving a Comic Con, which obviously involved creating comics, and then we built a project using our standards around that topic. And the
okay.
project became what we called Project Injustice: A Voice to the Voiceless. And
That's
the goal
hardcore.
was
That's so
the
serious.
well, the goal was that, I mean, comics are typically about the idea of standing up for ideals or standing up for people who are in weak positions, right? The idea was that you would make a comic book that encourages social change towards either an injustice or brings a voice to the voiceless. It brings a voice to those that are
Okay.
typically not heard from. That's the
Okay.
entire project outline. So as a result, kids are going to choose. I mean, there are like what 50 standards, maybe more in any given history or government class. Kids are going to do a bunch of different standards, but in my opinion, it doesn't matter because the creative application of doing this work, all the kids are going to learn a lot of content, and this is done alongside typical lessons. Like we still did standards based lessons, but I think the project has more value. But this is just using Photoshop filters. So this is,
Oh, okay.
and I used like Photopea, which is like the free version, or maybe
Yeah.
GIMP, which is a terrible name, but that was the name of the free Photoshop tool.
Yes.
These are stock images with a filter on it
Okay.
using a comic book software. So this is an example that I provided to the kids. It was about private prisons, and we got them this
Oh,
comic book software that was super cheap. I think it was called Comic Life, which allowed you to like
looks
easily
great.
make these panels, you know, with like the
Yeah.
letters
The
in
speech
there.
bubble.
You just like drag and drop to make them. And again, these are just stock images with a filter on them that makes it look
Oh, dude.
comic booky like that. Very, very easy, like a 3-step process. And we had the kids like make the script. We had them make the
Oh,
panels. I think I spent maybe 45 minutes making this example just to like
wow.
demonstrate how it could work. And
Look
I'd
at
use
you,
like a
Mr.
bunch of different
Comics.
examples about like how to make it work and then showcase it. We actually ordered the comics.
Oh,
Oh,
that
I
one
have a
looks
bunch of
cool.
screenshots of it. So here's,
That one looks like
uh,
watercolors.
yeah, these are watercolors. These ones, they did theirs by hand. So
Wow.
some of these I had to like crop out. So when the recording is going to look kind of weird because I have to crop out like student names, but like here's an example of someone who like hand drew theirs. Here's the box when I got it. That's my hand there. We ordered the comic books and sold them to raise money for I forget who we were donating it to, but they could order these comic books and we had them professionally printed. We actually did a Comic Con at the school. This is a picture of students doing a student panel where it was at like our annual expo night and the kids talked about like what they made like in a very like comic book Comic Con style fashion, and then people could go around and learn about the books and then order them to order, which is when they got the ordering result. Does that make sense? So
Wow.
like
Yeah.
they would like see the electronic version, they could order it. Here's an example. Students, they like doodled this one, and you can see they added in like the language and they just did like doodles on this one. Not everyone did like the electronic version. So in general, just to summarize, to go back to my original point, um, that project would never come to fruition if we would have had to have done like a step by step, like every single kid is going to do a comic book that symbolizes the first 3 amendments of the Constitution and includes all of this content. I think the more open ended it is, the better. And then every kid will learn something slightly differently. Sorry to make this like the longest introduction possible for my number one, but this also kind of leads into another hot take, which is I don't think that the vast majority of content in school actually does build on one another. I don't think it actually matters where you start 99% of the time. You'll learn the things that it builds off of in the course of learning about the thing that you're doing. So, like, I don't need to understand 1850 before I understand 1950. I can
Oh,
start with
right.
1950 and learn 1850 later. I think the same thing
Right.
goes in math, FYI. Like, there's some basic concepts, sure, but not nearly as structured as people typically try to present it as.
It's so interesting. I just had sent something out on social media about this the other day that was just like, if we had to wait for every piece of new learning to be explicitly taught to be learned, school would take like 57 years,
Yeah.
right? Because those models really assume that A, we don't come into the classroom that with any knowledge. And I'm not just talking about coming in kindergarten, but like it assumes that what you have outside of school does not exist. You come in a blank slate every single day about every single topic and really ignores the constructivism, which we know is true, right? It's how our brains construct an understanding of information and build schema about the world. If you had to build everything in our schema for everything explicitly, nobody would ever learn. Like our brains
Right.
are learning machines, you know, we can work with them a lot more efficiently than we can work against them, which is very often, but not always, right? What an
Hmm.
emphasis, an overemphasis on explicit, structured, blah, blah, blah instruction sometimes does. And you never actually get to the higher level stuff because you're just stuck. Was that both of your hot takes? I
No, that
can't
was
tell
just
now.
one.
That was
What
still
was
part of one. 22 minutes in here. Okay, I think my biggest hot take, my number one here is like in my heart of hearts, I am an unschooler. Like I side with the unschooling philosophy, the ethos. I am all on board with all of
bold?
that.
For context, can you add what unschooling is if people aren't familiar?
I think unschooling is probably it's probably a super not helpful label because it can be used to describe so many different things. But it's basically, the notion that you don't need a lot of formal education, especially as it is currently conceived, in order to be educated. I think if that makes a lot of sense.
But typically, an unschooler typically means that you don't send your kids to school and allow them to self-direct themselves at home to learn, right?
Yes. So that's what I was gonna add. I think
Mm.
oftentimes an associated label is self-directed education, because I don't wanna say it is a lack of formal education. Because very often, what do self-directed learners choose to do? They choose to take classes, and they choose to engage in, online learning spaces, and they go to libraries, and they do engage in formal activities, but it's, like, on their own terms, for what not for what the state level standards say you should be by the time you get done with 3rd grade, basically is what it is.
Got it. So is your hot
Um,
take that you support unschooling or that you are an unschooler or
my
both?
my hot take, if you would
Okay.
just let me finish, Chris, you had
All
20
right.
minutes,
I'm just trying to
sir.
figure out what you're saying.
No, so I wish that I had the courage, to, like, live and to, live with my own kids, I guess is what I try to get at. Like, I wish that I could, unschool my kids, and really, like, that's a cop out, to say that, "Oh, you can't for whatever reason." Of course, like, you can make that stuff work, and obviously there are systemic barriers. But I wish I could unschool my kids in a way that's more consistent with my values, which are more aligned with unschooling, I think, more than, formal education. And so, I think I'm fascinated by like Sudbury School's approaches to learning. Our relationship with Antonio at Abrome. I think that's a fascinating, way to learn too. Like these community learning centers where unschooled, self-directed kids can like voluntarily get together. Like it's an ethos and a way that I think of living and learning that I think is beautiful. I think it's humanizing. I really, I really lean into it and support it, even if you know, the realist in me too also understands that it's not scalable. It was like a model. We can't have an education system that is like an unschooled system. So,
Here's my 1.5 to that, which is I don't know if it's a challenge, and I wanna be very careful with my
yeah,
wording because I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm saying. So there's a cognitive dissonance here. I don't have children. If I did have children, I would likely unschool them in the given situation that we're in. So I'm totally with you on that point. I guess my 1.5 hot take is that if we were to see this as like an 80-20 principle type thing, like 80% of the time versus 20% of the time, I think that 80% of any given day in a typical school should be self-directed. Like we should make time for students to work on projects, things that interest them. It would be amazing if you could like sign up for classes that you're interested in, sign up for projects you want to do, have self-directed learning time, have the option on whether or not you want to take classes or maybe just work off on your own. Like have a lot of different things that you are able to do. Speaking of like the college argument, I think in a perfect world, especially high school and middle school, would look more like a college environment where you're signing up for what you
yeah,
want to do, have independent study tracks, etc.
yeah,
However, I do think that 20% of that time should be reserved for things that everyone is taught explicitly, that you don't have an
yeah,
option for if you take it or not.
yeah,
And the reason is that I'm always worried that the unschooling argument works if you're from a background where you value things like social justice, diversity, caring about others that are different than yourself, etc.
yeah,
However, that falls short. Like, what if I'm from a community that is explicitly racist or my family is racist? When am I going to get challenged on my belief structures? And
yeah,
I worry that a purely self-directed education without those confrontations, without those like that ickiness, I guess, that conflict could lead to kids never like truly being able to explore that. I want to be very clear. A lot of unschooling communities do bring those things up. And I think their argument may be that schools don't do a very good job of that right now anyway. But again, like, I want to fix that at the public school level and scale that up, as opposed to having to shift to like an entirely different thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, totally. And what I grabbed off my shelf just now is actually like a case study in that. So Rising Out of Hatred, written by Eli Saslow, but the subtitle is The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist, and it's the story of Derek Black, who was the would-be heir to like the
Mm,
white power, white nationalist movement in the 2000s, because they're just all bunch of old white guys who are,
mm,
dying off of old age and they need to pass it on to the next generation. Derek was homeschooled by his, white supremacist parents, went to all the conferences. Derek went to university in Florida against his parents' wishes. Kid who was homeschooled his whole life, right? Goes to university in Florida. It's actually the university now that Chris Rufo is like the New College. So he went to New
oh,
College in Florida, and
oh, he
it
was
was
radicalized by the woke agenda.
he was right. So
Mm,
which is funny in the book, and the book is incredible because it's essentially just like hours and hours of interviews kind of distilled through this journalist who had this relationship with Derek and talked about his deconversion and leaving the white nationalist movement as a result of his experiences on campus at the new college in Florida. Which, I think chalk one up, for higher education again. So of course, like I think those are tremendously powerful things. And again, that's where I can live in that tension and be like, okay, I think, if the values are right, and I don't know, it's such a messy conversation, right? But again, that's why this is an opinion that would have me at sword point, I suppose.
moving on to my number two. This one I think you might give me some flack on. I think this is like an actual hot take. I don't know if I've ever met another educator, at least in real life, that has had this opinion. I've read about it in a few books. Okay, so as you know, I used to teach social studies. I taught digital design later, but my major's in history. My number two is that it's perfectly acceptable and actually beneficial for students to know your political bias, especially in a social studies class.
Elaborate. I don't have strong feelings about this. I was waiting for it, man. I was waiting for some bomb to drop, but
Well, I think that people get really freaked out when you say this. It's the typical thing that teachers are taught in school is that you should never show your political biases and that you should try to be an objective um, creator of content. And please note, I am not saying that you should create lessons with a knowing political bias. But whenever we would talk, especially in government class, about politics, about political leanings, about like propaganda, about like content creation, etc., I would always tell students flat out, like, I think they probably already know, but like, these are my political leanings. When we have these discussions, I am trying my best to create materials, resources, etc., that showcase all sides of the story. But there is no denying that my political biases are going to impact the way that this content is being created. And I use that as a discussion tool, both in terms of like when we're talking about things as a class, but also when they're analyzing the material that's being presented to them. And
right.
the reason why I do that is that I try to present the opinion that nothing that you learn is neutral. Your teacher's background and politics are going to impact the content that they present to the class. And being able to analyze that is a college ready skill, because that's true in college as well, as opposed to trying to pretend like you have no political acumen or that like you're a completely neutral actor, which is not true. The act of being neutral is in and of itself political.
It's Howard Zinn's "You can't be neutral on a moving train," right? You're either
Yes,
moving at the
which
speed of the
is a
train,
really
or you're.
important book to my history teaching. FYI, I
See,
have that
there
book
you
in my
go.
notes. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's really interesting. I think, to some extent, I agree with you. Because I think it shows, like, I think just being really open and honest about things and just putting things out there on the table, and any amount of transparency is going to be helpful. Just be like, hey, here's who I am. Here's the perspective that I'm coming from. Feel free, right? Challenge. Let's have this discussion. We can just be open about the things that we believe. And I think it's helpful for kids to know, like, I can learn from a variety of people. So that way I don't have to, learn just from the people who agree with me on everything or who share my same values and beliefs and so on. And so I think that's totally legitimate. I think what's really interesting though is there, I, savvy kids also will just understand by the way that you are and
Yes.
what you do, like how what the real lay of the land is. And I think that that might be important too, because I also don't want kids, at least I wouldn't in the classroom, I wouldn't want kids to like try to put me in a box and be like, oh, you're just this, right? So you're always going to think about X, Y, and Z. And I think having at least the perception of objectivity like lets you bring up issues and know that, and kids will know like, okay, he's at least going to try to play a fair moderator because he doesn't have this explicit kind of perspective, if that makes some amount of sense. I
Yeah.
have
So the way I
benefited from.
introduced this was that I made sure that it was very clear that I'm not saying that when I prepare materials that I'm not trying to be objective. But the thing is, I taught in a fairly conservative area. The kids
Right.
already had those predispositions on like who I was as a teacher. And I found
Right.
that being more transparent about it actually allowed us to have more meaningful conversations as
Yeah.
opposed to attempting to remain neutral and having kids kind of be skeptical that everything that they were learning had some kind of bias to it. Like the laying
Yeah.
out, but the potential bias allowed it to be a more like critical community.
Yeah.
And I should know that like the vast majority of kids in my class who are conservative kids actually really liked my class. And I can tell you about the moment that I changed my thinking on this. It was in 2015 when I had multiple groups of students come up to me and ask me who I was voting for. And they all assumed I was voting for Trump unironically. So I thought to myself, man, if that's the type of demeanor and character that my class materials are presenting, I need to make
Just shut
some
this
more.
down.
Yeah, I need to make some more explicit connections to like who I am as a person in this classroom,
Yeah.
because it's not like I was being depicted as being conservative, which is fine. It was that I was presented as being a Trump supporter, which is a very different thing, especially in 2015 during the primary season when the rhetoric was even more, well, by today's standards, the rhetoric was not that
Oh,
extreme.
it was
But in
tame. It
2015,
was
the rhetoric was like absolutely like unbelievable to
at the
the average
time.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because it definitely does. Again, when you play the neutral, objective figure, because that's a part that you play. Because, like we just said, that's not a real thing. When you play that, you do send signals to students about who is valued and who isn't. And if you're able to be open about it, and again, this was something I would kind of slide in, later, or kids know, certain kids would know, as a result of social media and whatnot. But I still tried to like be a more objective figure, and I had really strong relationships with conservative students and everything else. It, but again, that comes at the cost of what I don't know if it was the right position that I took, because it comes at the cost too of maybe there are kids who are at the margins who might assume like, oh my gosh, Covington's this, almost 40-year-old white guy in Iowa. I bet doesn't he doesn't like me because I'm transgender, or I
Hmm.
bet he has weird opinions about race and I'm a black student, that I can see how just kind of being out and open about it could help assuage those views. At the same time, I think there might be the trade-off is alienating kids that we're trying to win over, who we might disagree with. I don't want them to just shut me out completely because they
Right.
they dismiss.
And I'm not saying this is something that would come up every day. Um,
Yeah,
I think it's just like a point that like there was a lesson in there where we would talk about that. Nor do I think the overall goal of a social studies class it should be to present a certain political bias. I think the
yeah,
facts speak for themselves. I think the more
yeah.
knowledgeable you are about history and government, the more obvious these solutions become.
Well, it-
I don't need to present a political bias. I can just show you everything that's happening, and you should be able to come to your own
right.
decisions.
what I think is interesting, right? We were just talking about this morning, is that like politics is not the same as partisanship, right? You can
Mhm.
be open about your perspectives on power and politics without picking a team, right? And I think that's pretty often how in our polarized society, especially today, students, parents, and community perceive that. And that's certainly how I was perceived, as being part of a particular team, which is not the case at all, right? I have a set of beliefs and values that I'm willing to defend. That is my right to defend, and that are acceptable classroom practices in the humanities as it related to my teaching, right?
Yeah. It also helps
And
too that, like, I would always present the fact I'm not a Democrat either.
yeah,
I don't
see,
like
so that's
Democrats. So,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
that is always very helpful. We can break out
Mhm.
of the team binary and like really get
Mhm.
to those issues. That's an interesting one. I'll be curious to see what people have
Yeah.
to say
And I should note too,
about
like, I
that.
totally get why that's not possible in certain settings where that would get you, like, fired. Like, I'm not
Oh yeah,
saying that, like, you're a bad teacher if you're not doing that. I just think there's a benefit to doing it if you can.
yeah. Again, remember, these are opinions that are going to have the you
Yeah.
surrounded
I
by
wanna make sure that, like, no one is
graded
misreading
edges.
what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you're a bad teacher if you don't do these things.
Chris thinks everyone should teach the woke curriculum.
Well, I do in that
I'm
regard.
gonna
That's
I'm
my
gonna tell Chris
my
Rufo on you.
I'll take a
I'm gonna send.
2.5 curriculum on that. I think that everyone should be teaching the woke agenda, sure.
That's your true hot take. All right, can I finally get to my second one now? I have tried in the last several months to move away from Twitter as being a primary space where I talk about education, because what I have seen is that
Mm,
same amount of polarization and really like vitriol, and the notion of education as a team sport really ramped up to 10. And obviously then I think there are side effects of it too, obviously with the ecosystem that Twitter has cultivated, particularly under its new ownership, that really has exacerbated those issues. And one thing that I think has rose to prominence, because it can kind of just be this viral phenomenon, is this some people have risen to prominence within certain spheres of educational Twitter by busting neuromyths, right? And so every so often they take it upon themselves to do a thread about learning styles, right? Or they
mhm,
they show some image about something that was in a PD book, and they're like, here's why the science says that this is wrong. And there's really just like kind of this I don't know, myth busting movement that's certain people. I don't know why I'm being so hedgy about this. I just don't want to name any names, but people have gotten a lot of followers, kind of doing this content, and really, it's like virtue signaling to people of a particular side. Be like, yeah, those people who do these kinds of things are really stupid, right? And I think
mm,
really the reason why I think my hot take is that that is not productive. I don't think
mm,
that is useful. I don't think that you should, make a name for yourself by just being the person who like busts these neuromyths. And of course, this is like big a subtweet at like a whole group of people that I'll be a hater on here for just a minute. But the reason why I don't think that's helpful is actually, ironically, based in what the research says about how you change people's minds. And that's not by beating them over the head with facts and logic. um, if anything, has shown us that has the opposite effect. And in fact, there's some research around what I think they call the backfire effect, where people just become more entrenched, and try to uh, uh, because really what these beliefs are like about identity. And especially in education, what we've found is that education and pedagogy is deeply personal. So your pedagogy is a reflection of your beliefs and values. And we very often pick and choose the ideas and practices and philosophies that we feel comfortable engaging with, because it's an interpersonal kind of thing. And so really changing people's minds is really not an appeal to a set of ideas or beating them over the head and saying that they're wrong about X, Y, or Z. But really building relationships, right? Attending to what is it? What is it about the appeal of an idea like learning styles that teachers embrace so often, even if a certain part of the research would say that a very specific application of learning styles, which I think is called like this meshing theory, right? Where you say like a certain person is this kind of learner. We need to match this with X kind of activity in a very, applied way. doesn't work to increase educational outcomes or whatever, right? Measured by standardized tests.
The only thing that I might add, which I don't even know if this is not what you're saying, but like I think it is worth calling people out for. You had mentioned earlier
Mm-hmm.
that it's not beneficial to call people out for behaviors that you want them to change. Like, as in, if you respond with like aggression or name calling or whatever it might be, that the chances of them converting to like what you're trying to say are very slim. I do see value though in calling out certain forms of extremism, which has been normalized in today's society. There's a lot of extremist ideas that are fairly normalized for what it is and not trying to lean away from that to make everybody feel okay. So like an example would be this idea we were talking about earlier of like the woke agenda. Folks who are trying to ban books in school that teach, for example, about LGBTQIA issues. I have no problem with saying that if you support that policy, you're transphobic, because you are. The implication is that if you're banning those books, that you're afraid that your kids are going to be exposed to something that might make them quote unquote transgender, which is not how that works, but that is your ideology.
Well, I think
That or you've been propagandized to think that somehow these books are teaching like sexual encounters or something.
right. Well, I think there's a difference, okay? Because I think like obviously calling out direct harm I think is really important. But the distinction I'm trying to make, and maybe I didn't make it make the point very well, is that calling something like saying like learning styles don't exist or learning styles are a myth, the corollary being if you practice those, you're hurting kids, is like
Mm.
what it is, right? You're like, so you're trying to shame teachers into not doing practices that are being responsive to some perceived need, right? Like I just need to be responsive to kids. Like that's a good thing to be. Um, and to shame and tell teachers that you're hurting kids by doing that, by engaging in learning styles, even if like it's just colloquially, right? Like, oh, learning styles. Like I prefer to listen to something rather than watch a video, or I prefer to read rather than, whatever.
Yeah. So
Those
you're
preferences
explicitly in that
exist.
lane of like the neuro side of this.
Like, what do you mean?
Or are you making like a more broad claim? You started off by saying that it's about calling out neuromyth, but then you said more broadly about like Twitter culture.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of both, but I want to
Okay.
like narrow it down to like specific educational practice, right? Where you're just like, if you do this in the classroom, where X is, some basically like a team signifier, if you
Mm.
do this kind of practice, hey, you're harming kids because this thing is shown not to work or whatever.
Mm.
And I use the example of learning myths or learning styles because that is the most frequent thing that I see. Or,
Mm.
there's the pyramid where it's like, you remember 10% of what you're told and 20% of what you listen to and 30%. And it's like, okay, there's not really a science that supports that. But what's the purpose of it is to say, oh, you should present information in different modalities that either kids can choose, which ones to engage with according to the ways that their own learning preferences and how they want to address that information, or you should just present in all those modalities and you'll be better for it because having a video with subtitles is going to be better for everyone than not.
Mm.
So yeah, it's stuff like
So
that where it's like
yeah,
it cap it
I'll add in a
yeah.
quick 2.5 then.
All right.
This will be my last thing. My quick 2.5 is that I think edu celebrity culture is
Ooh,
toxic as all get out, and people
hot
shouldn't
take.
be putting any individual as their methodology for why they do things in a classroom. And I
Right
think
on.
both the more conservative actors that you're talking about are guilty as this, as much as folks I think like in our aisle. Like I love Alfie Kohn, huge Alfie Kohn fan, read all of his books, huge fan of his videos, etc. But I don't think it's a good idea to be referencing or thinking to yourself like Alfie Kohn's this great educator and we should just follow what he says. Like
Right.
that to me is it's super toxic, but it also makes you go into this camp of like you're an Alfie Kohn person. And that anyone that
Right.
critiques Alfie Kohn or has different opinions than Alfie Kohn must
You
like
have to
not be in
rise to the challenge, to their
your camp.
defense. then it becomes more about the person than it does about the ideas. And any time then, someone becomes immune from critique because of who they are rather than like what it is that they're saying, it's not a personal affront to them to say like, oh, like either I disagree or this idea I think is wrong, or I have a different belief about this and I'm going to go in my way and you're going to go in your way and we will agree to disagree, right? Like, I think those things are fine. And yeah, when it comes down to choosing a side, are you for, this or against this? And it's like education is never going to be that simple. I think some things are. I think some things are that simple. I think education is generally not one of those areas that it makes a lot of sense to retreat into this camp. Thanks for watching. What other education opinions have you at the point of multiple and various serrated blades? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.